spent 11 years building the Hargrove Group's restaurant empire from a single failing steakhouse in downtown Nashville into a 14-location chain with a wait list that stretched 6 weeks out. I knew every vendor contract, every lease renewal date, every chef's quirk, every health inspector's name. I was the one who called the produce supplier at 5 a.m. when the refrigeration unit died at our Midtown location. I was the one who rewrote the POS system workflow when the original developer ghosted us 3 days before our flagship reopening. I was the one who sat with Edwin Hargrove in his hospital room after his first cardiac event and walked him through the quarterly numbers because he couldn't sleep and needed to know his life's work was still standing. "You're not just an operations director," Edwin told me once, adjusting his oxygen monitor with one hand and scrolling a spreadsheet with the other. "You're the memory of this company. You hold everything." I didn't know then how dangerous that would turn out to be. His name was Callum, Edwin's only son. He came back from 18 months in Portugal, where he'd been consulting for a hospitality group that, as far as I could tell from the photos he posted, mostly involved boat parties and aged wine, and walked into our Tuesday ops meeting like he'd never left. Tan, easy smile, wearing a linen shirt that probably cost more than my first paycheck here. "Dad's stepping back," he said, setting his coffee down on my planning binder without moving it. "I'm taking over day to day." Edwin hadn't called me first. That was the part that in my chest like a splinter. I'd worked for Edwin since I was 24 years old, fresh out of a hospitality management program, carrying a folder of color-coded proposals to an interview he'd agreed to take only because his office manager owed my professor a favor. I wasn't the most polished candidate. I wasn't the one with the family connection or the fancy internship, but I was the one who noticed, sitting in the waiting room, that the reservation system they had posted on the wall was routing call volume inefficiently, and I sketched a fix on the back of my resume before I even walked in the door. Edwin hired me on the spot. For 11 years I learned everything. I learned it because I loved it. The logistics of it, the way a well-run restaurant felt like a living thing with a heartbeat. How the difference between a good night and a disaster could come down to whether the expo line was staffed correctly at 7:15 p.m. I built the vendor matrix. I negotiated the group insurance package that saved us $340,000 annually. I designed the training program that cut new manager onboarding from 12 weeks to 5. I wasn't trying to make myself irreplaceable. I was just trying to make the company excellent. But excellence, it turns out, can look like leverage when someone else needs you gone. Callum and I were polite at first. Professionally polite, the kind where every sentence ends cleanly and no one says what they mean. I briefed him every morning. I answered every question. I introduced him to vendors, walked him through the lease structures, explained the Nashville Metro licensing process that had taken me 3 years to fully understand. He nodded a lot. He took very few notes. And then he met Josephine. She was a friend of someone he'd known in Lisbon, a self-described brand strategist who had redesigned the social media presence of a small hotel group in the Algarve and apparently now considered herself an expert in restaurant operations. She was sharp, I'll give her that. She knew how to talk. She said things like the guest experience ecosystem and emotional touch points at the point of service, and rooms full of people nodded along. Within 6 weeks, she was consulting for us. Within 10 weeks, she had an office 2 doors down from mine. Within 4 months, Callum told me, with genuine warmth in his voice, that they were restructuring the operations role and that my position was being reimagined. "We want to move toward a more distributed leadership model," he said. "Joe's brought in some incredible frameworks." "I know what a distributed leadership model is," I said. "Of course you do," he smiled. "We'd love for you to stay on in a transitional capacity. 12 weeks. Help Joe get up to speed on the systems. 12 weeks to hand over 11 years of institutional knowledge to someone who had never run a restaurant in her life." I looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," I said. I didn't think about it for very long. Here's what Callum didn't understand. Because he had been in Portugal on a boat, drinking wine. I had built the operational backbone of the Hargrove Group on a custom platform. Not off-the-shelf software, not a standard restaurant management system, something I had designed with a developer I'd hired out of pocket, and then presented to Edwin, who had licensed it formally through the company. But the ongoing maintenance contract, the vendor relationships, the custom integrations with our point of sale across all 14 locations, those ran through me. Every quarterly audit, every vendor renewal, every system update. I wasn't trying to build a trap. I was just the one who always showed up. But when I walked out of that meeting and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, staring at the concrete wall, something shifted in me. I wasn't going to train my replacement. I wasn't going to spend 12 weeks smiling while someone dismantled what I'd built and handed it to a brand strategist from the Algarve. I was going to leave, cleanly, professionally, with my dignity intact. I submitted my resignation that afternoon. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately after. Callum emailed back within the hour. So sorry it came to this. Wishing you all the best in your next chapter. That emoji. A little sun. Like we were ending a casual group chat. I cleared my office over the weekend. I left nothing. Every binder, every backup drive, every contact sheet I had built manually over a decade. I took it all, because it was mine. None of it was proprietary to the company. It was my knowledge, my relationships, my work. On my last day, I stopped by Edwin's house. He'd been recovering from his second cardiac event at home in Brentwood, surrounded by a medical team Callum had arranged, and he wasn't receiving most visitors. But his housekeeper had known me for years, and she let me in. Edwin was in the sunroom, sitting upright in a chair that probably cost more than most cars, looking out at the garden. He looked smaller than I remembered, the way very certain people do when their context is stripped away when you see them outside the thing that made them large. "Nadia," he said when I came in. "I wanted to say goodbye," I told him, properly. He was quiet for a moment. "Then he told me you resigned." "I did." "He told me it was mutual." I didn't say anything. Edwin closed his eyes. "You built this, you know." "More than he knows, I know," I said. And I meant it without bitterness. I really did. I had built it. That was real. That happened. No one could take that. I squeezed his hand before I left. 3 weeks later, my phone started buzzing. Not from Callum directly. He was too proud for that. It came through the GM of our Germantown location first, a woman named, well, she wasn't listed in anyone's restructuring documents. She was just the one who actually knew how things worked. She texted me on a Thursday evening. "Nadia, I don't know what's going on, but the inventory system has been throwing errors since Tuesday, and the new team can't figure it out, and we had to. 8612 items at dinner service. Do you know anyone I can call?" I read the message twice. Then I put my phone face down on the table and went back to watching television. I'd been doing a lot of that, sleeping in. Going to yoga classes at 10 a.m. on weekdays, which felt surreal and wonderful. Meeting a friend for lunch without checking my email every 14 minutes. I had taken a short-term consulting engagement with a boutique hotel group in Memphis, just 3 days a week, and the work was clean and simple and the people were grateful. I didn't answer the GM's text that night. By the following Tuesday, I'd received 6 messages from various people across the Hargrove group, managers, a sous chef, the woman who handled our event bookings and had been trying to get Josephine to understand how the private dining contracts worked. Every single one of them hedging careful, not quite asking me directly, but asking. Then Callum's assistant called. "He's wondering if you'd be willing to come in," she said in the careful voice of someone delivering a message they hadn't been given good language for. "For what purpose?" I asked. "To consult on the system issues." "I'm currently engaged with another client," I said. "If he wants to discuss a formal consulting arrangement, he can send me a proposal in writing." She said she'd pass that along. He didn't send a proposal. What he sent 2 days later was an email, carefully worded, no emojis this time, explaining that the transition had presented some unexpected operational friction, and that the company would appreciate my guidance on a short-term basis, and that they were prepared to discuss appropriate compensation. I read it 3 times. I thought about Edwin in that sunroom. I thought about the GM in Germantown having to 86 her entire fish section because no one could figure out the inventory sync. I thought about the 11 years I'd shown up before anyone else and left after everyone else and never once asked for a sun emoji in return. I wrote back. I told him I was willing to consult at my standard rate, which I named. It was 3 times what they'd paid me annually, prorated to hourly. I told him the engagement would run a maximum of 8 weeks. I told him I would work with his team remotely, I would not be coming into the office, and I would not be training Josephine. I told him the goal of the engagement was to stabilize operations and document the systems properly, and that at the end of 8 weeks, whatever he did with that documentation was his business. He accepted within 4 hours. I want to be honest about what came next, because it wasn't triumphant in the way you might want it to be. It wasn't a movie. I logged into the remote sessions and I fixed the inventory errors, which were, as I suspected, caused by a configuration change someone had made to the POS integration without understanding what it was connected to. And I documented everything carefully, and I divvied him carefully, and I billed my hours, and I answered the questions that were actually answerable. Josephine never reached out directly. I heard through one of the GMs that she had stepped back from the day-to-day operations role to focus on brand development, which I suspected meant the chaos had clarified some things for everyone involved. Edwin passed away in the 6th week of my consulting engagement. I found out from the same housekeeper who had let me into the sunroom. She called me before the company announcement went out. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. Not crying exactly, just sitting, thinking about the man who had hired me off the back of a scribbled note about call routing, who had trusted me completely and then, at the end, had let his son make a decision without telling me first. I thought about both of those things at once and found that I could hold them together, the gratitude and the hurt, without needing to resolve them into something cleaner. He was a complicated man. He had built something real. He had also, in that last year, let loyalty run along bloodlines instead of merit, the way people sometimes do when they're afraid. I finished the consulting engagement. I submitted my final documentation and my final invoice. I didn't attend the company-wide memorial service, though I sent flowers. I heard later, from the Memphis hotel group, where I'd taken on a larger role by then, that Callum had brought in an operations firm from Atlanta to take over the systems work. A real firm with a real team, charging real rates. The kind of thing Edwin and I had always avoided because we thought we could do it better ourselves. Maybe we could. For a while. Here's the thing, nobody tells you when you build something that depends entirely on you, you're not actually protecting it. You're borrowing against it. Every year you hold the whole architecture in your head. Instead of distributing it properly, you're taking out a loan you'll eventually have to repay. I wasn't a victim of what happened. I was also, in some real way, part of what made it possible. I had built myself into a single point of failure because it felt like security. And it wasn't security, it was fragility dressed up as indispensability. I don't say that to excuse what Callum did. What he did was arrogant and careless, and it cost the people who worked there. The GMs and sous chefs and event coordinators who had nothing to do with his decisions. Real disruption and real stress. That part was on him. But the other part was on me. And I've had to sit with that. I took a full-time position in Memphis 8 months after I left Nashville, director of operations for a growing hospitality group with 4 properties and ambitions for 8. My first week, I brought in a documentation specialist. My second week, I set up a cross-training program so that no function in the company lived only in one person's head, including mine. I think about Edwin sometimes. I think about the sunroom and the way he said my name when I walked in. Like he was relieved to see me. Like I was something familiar in a world that had started moving too fast for him. I think about the decade of Tuesday mornings and 5 a.m., phone calls and the strange intimacy of knowing someone's business better than they know it themselves. I think about the fact that I never told him what I was really feeling when Callum walked into that ops meeting. Maybe I should have. Maybe the whole thing could have gone differently if I'd said, clearly and directly, Edwin, this is what I've built and this is what's at risk and I need you to be honest with me about what's happening. Maybe he would have listened. Maybe he wouldn't have. I'll never know. What I know is this. I was 33 years old, and I had spent the best decade of my professional life making someone else's dream excellent. And then I left. And the dream wobbled without me, and I steadied it one last time. And then I let it go. That's not a tragedy. It's not a triumph either. It's just what happened, and I'm still here. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in an abstract way. In the very specific, concrete way you think about things when you've had enough quiet time to actually trace the line from one decision to the next and see clearly where it led. The honest version is this. What happened to me didn't come out of nowhere. Callum made careless choices. Josephine stepped into a space she wasn't equipped for. Edwin, in his last stretch of life, let affection override judgment. All of that is true, and also true, and this is the part I had to sit with for a long time, is that I had spent 11 years building a structure that only I fully understood. I told myself it was dedication, and it was. But it was also, underneath that, a way of making sure I was needed. There's a difference between being excellent and being the only one who can do something. I confused them for a long time. That's the integrity piece, I think. Being honest with yourself about your own motivations is harder than being honest with anyone else. I genuinely loved that work. I also genuinely needed to feel irreplaceable. Both things were true, and I only really examined the second one after I left. That's not a comfortable thing to admit. But it's the truth, and the truth is the only useful starting point. The intelligence piece, and I mean practical intelligence, the kind that actually serves you, is knowing when the system you've built stops protecting you and starts trapping you. I had so much knowledge about the Hargrove Group that I had effectively made myself impossible to leave gracefully. Not impossible to fire, just impossible to leave on my own terms, with everything properly handed off, with the people I cared about taken care of. When Callum moved the way he did, I didn't have a clean exit because I'd never built one. I'd always assumed the relationship with Edwin was the flaw. It wasn't. Nothing is the flaw except the work you've done to make yourself whole outside of any one place. And the resilience part that came later. It came in Memphis, in a smaller office with fewer locations and a team that actually asked questions instead of just nodding. It came in the moment I hired a documentation specialist in my first week. Not because anyone told me to, but because I understood finally what it costs to be the only person who knows how something works. Resilience isn't bouncing back to who you were. It's building something different because you actually learned something. Edwin is gone now. Callum is running the company with outside help and probably a much more distributed system than he would ever admit he needed. I don't carry bitterness about any of it anymore. Not because I've forced myself to let go, but because bitterness requires you to keep revisiting a version of the story where things should have gone differently. I don't need that version. What happened shaped what came next. What came next is genuinely good. I'm still here. I'm building something again. This time, building it in a way that doesn't depend entirely on me. That's not a small thing. That took everything I went through to learn.